Before the 18th century, there wasn't really anything anyone could point at and call an economy. In Europe, and throughout the rest of the world for that matter, buying and selling weren't a big part of people's everyday lives, as most were farmers, of a kind, who lived off what they grew themselves. But, during the 18th century, long-established ways of organizing society started changing. People started to become dependent on markets, both factor markets and product markets, to survive. In 1776, Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations and became an early and formative contributor to what we would call the classical school of economics, which asserted that value came from labor. Smith lived, thought, and wrote during a time of great transition. Britain and Western Europe had lived under a feudal system for centuries where land-owning aristocrats were the dominant class in society. Smith, however, saw that a new class was emerging, a capitalist class, that had the potential to unleash productive forces that would benefit all of society. He recognized that the rise of this new class meant the unseating of the old, as the rents that the landowners were charging increased costs of production for capitalists. Smith saw the death of old traditional ways of organizing society as a good thing because he believed self-interested actors could actually self-organize in a sort of spontaneous way, which also produced better outcomes. Adam Smith called this organizing principle the invisible hand, which we now call the price mechanism. He believed that people pursuing their own personal gain can result in positive social outcomes. This is a famous quote from The Wealth of Nations, which you can read if you pause the video. It encapsulates his belief that society is better off when people are left to their own devices. This is why we say Smith had a laissez-faire approach, which means he thought the state shouldn't intervene too much in economic affairs, though he did believe that the state had a duty to provide public services, especially those that would drive down costs of production. From 1815 to 1846, there was a vigorous debate over what were called the Corn Laws in Britain. The Corn Laws were tariffs on imported grain from continental Europe, whose industry was not as developed as that in Britain, and was able to produce grain more cheaply than British farmers could. Another classical economist, David Ricardo, carried on the labor theory of value inherited from Smith, and he argued against these tariffs. The tariffs protected agrarian British landowners because it allowed them to charge more for grain, as they weren't competing with foreign grain producers. This meant British workers had to pay more for food, raising living costs, which meant industrial capitalists had to pay them more. Ricardo believed it would be better if Britain focused on producing manufactured goods, mainly textiles, while importing cheaper food, making it cheaper for British workers to sustain themselves, which means British firms wouldn't have to pay them as much, which meant they could become even more competitive. Ricardo expressed this in his theory of comparative advantage. Britain had a comparative advantage in manufactured goods, and continental Europe had one in agricultural goods. Another key economist in the 19th century was Baptiste, who believed that the economy trended towards full employment as supply created its own demand, as the incomes generated through producing goods and services are then used to buy those goods and services. Every cost in the production process is someone else's income, which is then spent on goods made from other production processes. As the 19th century went on, Smith and Ricardo got what they wanted. The power of the old aristocracy, which lived off rents that the landlords earned in their sleep, had faded, and was now wielded by the new industrial capitalist, who lived off profits, which had to be hard-won in the battlefield of market competition. This was why Britain's economy was taking off. The Industrial Revolution was underway. Karl Marx, in the mid-19th century, wasn't happy, though. He agreed that the aristocrats were parasitic, but he also thought the capitalists were exploitative. He also inherited the labor theory of value from the classical economists before him, but Marx believed that all value came from labor, so therefore profits were unearned, just like rents, as workers don't own the goods that their labor produces, their employers do. He also thought that capitalism would eventually end once workers realized that they were the ones making everything in the first place, which would bring about socialism, where the state represented workers. He thought that then there would only be one class, workers, which is to say there wouldn't be any classes at all, which would eventually lead to a classless, stateless society. That didn't happen. Instead, we had the Marginal Revolution of the 1870s, where, almost simultaneously, three economists across Europe developed theories that posited value came from utility, not labor. Now, instead of value being determined by how much labor goes into the good, it's determined by how much the consumer, who's considered a perfectly rational actor, values the item. Consumers value goods based on how much satisfaction, which we call utility, they can get from consuming them. Their models assume that people, as economic agents, are rational utility maximizers, who are only concerned with extracting the most satisfaction they can get from consuming goods and services. That means consumers make their decisions on the margin. Marginal utility refers to how much utility a consumer can expect from consuming the next unit of a particular good, and consumers will consume a good if they value the utility that they would get from consuming the good more than how much it costs for them to purchase it. Their models also posited that marginal utility falls the more someone consumes a good. Each additional slice of pizza is less and less satisfying than the one before it. This is one of the ways we derive the downward sloping demand curve. As consumers consume more of a good, each additional unit becomes less and less satisfying for them. Since the demand curve reflects the willingness of a consumer to purchase something at a given price, as quantity increases, the price at which a consumer is willing to purchase the good must become lower. Continuing in the tradition of Say's law, these economists believe the economy would trend towards full employment, which they characterize as a general equilibrium, where all markets clear and resources are allocated in a way that maximizes utility for everybody. The theories that sprang from the Marginal Revolution held strong in the minds of important people until the Great Depression in the 1930s. Those theories said if markets were left alone and the price mechanism was not interfered with, the economy should self-adjust to full employment. They believed that if there was unemployment, it would drive down wages, as the supply of available labor would drive down the price of labor, wages. Once wages fell, employers would hire more workers as they become cheaper, resolving the unemployment problem through market mechanisms. However, the experience of high unemployment during the Great Depression showed everyone that the economy didn't just self-adjust. Keynes's theories emphasized the importance of aggregate demand, as he believed that, in opposition to Say's law, supply doesn't create its own demand. In fact, deficient demand is the norm. Keynes said that this was in part because wages weren't flexible, that they could go up easily, but it was harder for them to go down, making them sticky. This can be reflected in the Keynesian AS curve. Now, as a quick aside, if you're just starting the course, you haven't met this diagram or the next one I'm going to show you yet, but you'll become very familiar with them soon enough. Here is where the economy is operating at full employment. This level of national output, YFE, is similar to when the economy is on the production possibilities curve, making Y1 a level of national output that is inefficient, as there are underemployed factors of production, similar to an economy operating within the PPC. During the Great Depression, there was a large negative output gap, meaning unemployment, which can be shown here, the difference between actual and potential national output. The key insight Keynes had was that in order to get closer to full employment, the government had to intervene by increasing spending, which would increase aggregate demand, closing the output gap. When the private sector is unwilling to hire and spend, the government must. There's only a trade-off between economic growth and inflation once the economy gets close to full capacity, as factors of production become scarcer. Out here, there's plenty of spare capacity, so the government can increase spending, or the central bank can increase the money supply, and increase AD without raising prices, until we get closer, and increases in production start to create bottlenecks, and costs of factors of production begin to rise. His policies were a success, and the 30 years of stable growth after the Second World War, that was more or less enjoyed by large swaths of the economy, are largely credited to him and his theories. The Keynesian era ended around the middle of the 1970s, a time when many countries, especially the United States, experienced a rise in both unemployment and inflation. This went against the Keynesian model, which asserted that high levels of unemployment should go with low prices. Stagflation opened the door for the monetarists, who believed that the government and central bank manipulations of aggregate demand only resulted in inflation in the long run, and, hearkening back to the marginalists before them, they believed that the economy would automatically return to full employment if only the price mechanism were allowed to do its job. Let's say a negative output gap arises due to deficient demand. A Keynesian would say that intervention is necessary to get employment back to where it was, but a monetarist would say that this unemployment should result in a fall in wages, as a pool of available workers would bring down the price of labor. This would result in a fall in the cost of production for firms across the economy, which can be shown with the rightward shift of the SRIS curve. Now we're back at full employment, with a lower price level, while a Keynesian would have just put us in the same position, with more inflation. This put the monetarists in league with the New Classical School, who also advocated for a more hands-off approach. New Classicals wanted to free up markets by changing laws, specifically those that would weaken the position of labor unions, which would allow for wages to be more flexible, especially in the down direction, and deregulation generally, which allowed firms to further reduce costs and operate more freely. Finally, a large part of the New Classical agenda was the privatization of state-owned assets like railway or telecommunications infrastructure. They believed the private sector could run things more smoothly, as they were motivated by profit to be as efficient as possible. The models espoused by the New Classicals were in the tradition started by the marginal revolutionaries of the 1870s, in that they viewed people as rational utility maximizers. However, in reality, this is an oversimplification at best and flatly wrong at its worst. People aren't as perfectly rational as economic models assume them to be. They lack the mental capacity to immediately select the exact goods and services that will maximize their expected lifetime utility. People don't spend their lives coldly calculating how to maximize their own personal satisfaction. They care about others as well, making altruistic behavior difficult for these models to explain. There are other social forces that motivate people beyond pure satisfaction as well, like peer pressure. Recognition of these nuances have given rise to behavioral economics, which says that since people aren't rational, their behavior can be modified through subtle interventions. These interventions, called nudges, try to alter behavior in the consumer without economic coercion. For example, instead of taxing unhealthy food or subsidizing healthy food, which interfere with the price mechanism, we can employ visual cues or select healthy default options to unconsciously get consumers to adopt healthier practices. That being said, are nudges solving an imaginary problem? Behavioral economics rejects the assumptions made about human nature the new classical school makes, but it readily adopts the idea that government intervention is inherently bad without justifying it. While people don't like to be taxed, they also wouldn't like to be told that their behavior is being modified without their knowledge.